Matthew David, whose name means beloved gift of God. And he has been all of that to us and all of his wonderful friends.
With us today is David and Mary Jo Hudson, and Matthew is nearby. And let's just take a moment. If you just introduce yourself to the church. Now that sounds a little silly because you were here before most of our people. But at the same time, we have so many people that haven't met you. So maybe just a quick introduction of yourself. You don't need to give the whole history of how long you've been around, but I guess go back as far as you'd like and just get us familiar.
We're part of the original crew that started what was then Heartland Church many years ago in the early 90s, and we've been around for a long time.
Wow. Original Gold Card founding members of Lifehouse.
Yeah, that's right.
So I've been here a little while. Well, as we get started, let's begin. I'll go back to the beginning a little bit in terms of the story of David and Mary Jo. Where does that story start?
Mary Jo and I went to the same church, and I was in the choir, and she joined the choir. And she says that she'd gone to the church for a whole year, and I didn't pay any attention to her until she joined the choir. So she's in the choir, and we spend a lot of time together in church. And we develop a really deep friendship, strong bond, and over the years. And eventually, she and I both joined Youth with a Mission. And so we left the church, and I went to the Middle East, and Mary Jo went to Europe. And this was 5 years after we met. And so I'm in Amman, Jordan, and it's about 4 o'clock in the morning, and the minaret went off to call Muslims to pray. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't get back to sleep because it's very loud.
It is loud.
And so I got up to pray. I was in this little church, and I was kneeling at the altar, and I was praying about this or that or the other thing, and the scripture came into my mind where the angel says to Joseph, "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife." And that came to my mind. Now what's interesting is that one of my best friends, when we were back in Iowa, had said to me, after he looked at our relationship, and he said, "You know what, I could see you marrying Mary Jo." And I had this sick feeling in my stomach. And I like to say that, not because she wasn't attracted to me, but because it would have been like marrying my sister in the Lord. And who nobody does that. So I had no sense that I loved Mary Jo deeply. But then that day, that night, at the altar, and the Lord said, use that scripture, "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife." In an instant, it was like the blinders came off of my eyes, and I was overwhelmed with a love for Mary Jo. And that morning in 1977, I thought, I'm going to marry her. Mm-hmm. But we never got on the same continent. I went to South America, she went to Italy. Eventually, we're in Iowa again together 3 years later, and we were going to get married. And I remember calling her a couple weeks before our wedding, and I said, "You know, honey, we've never been on a date." And in the 8 years that we had known each other, we had never had a date. So I said, "Our kids will never believe." So I said, "Let's go on a date." And we went out to eat. And we had one date before we got married.
One date.
Yeah, one date. And that was...
Travel the world in one date and get married.
Yeah, right. So that was...
We're slow learners. It took us 3 years to figure out that if this relationship was going anywhere, we should live on the same continent.
So we finally got together. And that was 44 years ago.
44 years ago. Wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive. Mm-hmm. So when you finally got together, and I assumed you maybe stopped traveling the world as much as you had, what were sort of those early dreams that were planted in your heart? What were the things that you had aspired and thought about that you'd do with your life together?
I think mission was always important to us. having been in Youth with a Mission, we always had a focus for mission-oriented things. And maybe we go back to the mission field, or maybe we would be tent makers that supported missionaries or missions in some capacity.
And in fact, well, at least through the early days of the church, you were very, very involved in missions, sending of the brants and things like that. Right. So you were able to live some of that out. And even now, I know that you heavily support missions and,
right.
and what God does everywhere. And then the little ones started entering the picture.
Yep.
Tell us about those early days. Maybe introduce just your children and the ages and everything, and just tell us about those early days as a family.
So we have 4 children. John is our oldest. He's currently a software engineer living in New York City. Anna is next, and she works for Design Thomas, which is a premier interior design, doing content creation. And Matthew is our 3rd child, and Hallie is our 4th. In 3 weeks, she'll get her degree in optometry. She'll be a doctor of
awesome.
Optometry. And she has our only grandchildren, 2 little girls that we think are pretty special.
Yes, and they are beautiful. And that's all quite
so.
Impressive, yes.
We had, when we first got married, we thought we were going to have 6 kids. Then we had 1. And then we thought, well, 5. And then we had 2. And then, we'd be happy with 4. So we got 4. And we homeschooled, Mary Jo homeschooled for the grade school years for all 4 kids. So that was a lot. That was a lot of work.
16 years. Mm-hmm.
And then they went to public school for junior high and high school. But she was very faithful to teach the kids every day.
We have some good stories about those homeschool, and they all hated the math curriculum that we have. But Hallie is married to an engineer, and they've done some home remodeling. And one day I said, I bet you're glad you're married to an engineer. And she said, he's really good at complicated math, but I do all the fractions. And I said, oh, this curriculum. And she said, I know I hated it, but I'm really good at fractions.
That's awesome. Well, they're all doing quite well, so you've definitely you taught them well. So they would be great parents to talk to about homeschooling then, if you ever have questions about that life. So
experience, yeah.
So then tell us about Matthew. I guess one of the things I've always been very sad about is I didn't really know Matthew. I never really met Matthew prior to his injury. I wish I had. I really, truly do. But tell us about him as a young boy, and I guess leading up to the significant change in his life.
100% boy.
Yeah, 100% boy. Matt had a little bit of mischief in him. He was the athlete of our group. One day, in all seriousness, he said to me, I don't understand why you want to read a book when you could throw a ball. And he was dead serious because his siblings loved to read, and he just could not fathom how that could be entertaining when you had other options.
And he couldn't sit still.
No, he couldn't sit still. I mean, there'd be times that he'd say, if I don't go bounce a ball, my legs are going to explode. And so that was one of the reasons we homeschooled him, because he's just very busy little boy. I have this recollection of standing at the kitchen sink one day, and Hallie had this foghorn voice, and I could hear her behind me, and she said, Mom, make him stop. And I turned around, and Matthew was behind her, and he has her arms stuck to her side. He has his arms wrapped around her. She's like in a straitjacket, and she can't get away from him. And I said, Matt, I don't think your sister wants you to do that. And he said, what? I'm just telling her how much I love her. So he just was full of it. He could turn any situation to be, I'm not to blame.
He just loved all sports. It didn't just if there was a ball involved, he enjoyed sports, and
it didn't have to be a ball. He and his father could not be in the same room without physically touching one another, wrestling. And I used to call it the Bull Moose Club, because it was like the young bull and the old bull, and who's going to have dominion in the house, and the games they would create.
Matt and I were very physical. I was more physical with Matt than the other 3. And we wrestled a lot, and we had a game called the bad breath game, and so this involved me putting him into a headlock and then breathing onto his nose long enough so that he couldn't hold his breath that long. And so
Sounds like a perfect dad game right there.
yeah, and so one morning he'd gone to school, and I thought, I'm not going to brush my teeth all day. So when he gets home, when I put him in a headlock, he's going to faint when he smells my breath, and he did kind of scream in that moment, and I was successful, but he was a lot of fun, and we had a basketball hoop out here in the garage or on the driveway, and we'd go out and shoot, and so he was pretty good, much better than I was. So anytime Matt would try to do a layup, I would just pull his pants down, his gym shorts, just to distract him, and he'd yell, "Dad, stop that!" And then he'd miss the shot, and then I could win. But I think he enjoyed all that stuff, that we did together.
Sure he did.
But he also had a heart of, he was real compassionate. And tell the story about the girl in school who was not liked by others or...
Mm-hmm. We did not know this until after Matt's injury, but Matt's friends all played sports, or they were in show choir or band together. And apparently, according to this little girl, they were the cool kids. And she wrote us a note and said, Matt always talked to me in the hallway, and I was so embarrassed because I had braces and my glasses were real thick, and I was just a nobody. But he always spoke to me. He was really kind-hearted. We have another story about his best friend lived up the street, and he came upon his best friend and teasing another boy. And he said, "What's going on here?" And this friend said, "Well, he looks like his shoes came from Goodwill." And Matthew's thinking, "I always wear thrift clothing. It's all right." And he said, "It's okay. His shoes look just fine." And the friend said, "No, they don't. They came from the thrift store." And Matt said, "If you don't leave this kid alone, I'm going to beat you to a pulp." He's telling me the story about his little friend, and I said, "Matt, you just made a friend for life," because he just would stand up for the underdog, and he was very kind-hearted. And of all of the children, Matt would be the first one to offer to help. Can I do something to help you? And he just loved to help other people. He was really compassionate.
That's wonderful.
We have another story, and you can edit any of these out, but one day I said, "Hey, Matt, there's some mail for you on the front table." And he said, "Oh, I've been waiting for that." He had seen an ad on television for adopting children, like with Compassion International or one of those things. So he called the number, asked for the information, and they're really wise. They send a boy and a girl picture, and you get to choose. And he really struggled with this. And we talked about how much money he made at his job and how that would change in the fall when school started. And he said, "Well, if I sponsor both of these children, it'll cost me one Subway sandwich a week. And I think they probably need my sponsorship more than I need a Subway sandwich." So that was the way he
awesome.
calculated things. And so I was really proud of him. We figured out how that was going to happen, that financial transaction would take place. And he just had other people in mind all the time.
I wonder where he gets that from.
I don't know. His dad, I think.
So tell us then about that day, July 28th, 2004. All of this changes in a very radical way. Life changes. Tell us about what happened to Matthew that day.
Well, we had lunch. Hallie and I and Matt had lunch. Mary Jo was working at a part-time job away from home. And Matthew had a shopper to deliver at noon. And he came home, and he was going to have football practice that afternoon, so he went to the basement to play a video game. And just a couple hours later, he came upstairs, and he had a headache. He was nauseous, didn't feel well. And so I told him to go lay down, and I thought maybe it could be dehydrated because of the football practices and stuff. So he went to lay down, but not too much longer after that, I could hear him moaning in his bathroom, and he was on the floor. He was coming in and out of consciousness, and when he was conscious, he couldn't remember like the day of the week and what he'd had for lunch a few hours before. And so I thought maybe he was dehydrated, but we decided to, Mary Jo came home and we went to the hospital. And when we walked from the house to our car here, Matthew didn't have a shirt on, and he couldn't figure out how to put his t-shirt on. He couldn't mentally, just like, Dad, help me with this t-shirt. And so we took him to the hospital, and we waited for an hour to be seen by somebody. And then the nurse came in, and she looked at him, and she thought, well, maybe he has the flu. And he stopped breathing right then. So it was an immediate code blue.
Sure.
And within seconds, there were 9 medical people in the little room. And they intubated him immediately, right there. And then, sadly, he had a bilateral stroke, which was very severe. And so he began to have seizure activity, and they couldn't transport him to tertiary hospital for neurology because he was unstable. So we had to wait about 3 hours before he stabilized long enough to transport him to another hospital. And by the time we got him to the second hospital, and there'd been a lot of damage, he went right into surgery. And the neurosurgeon came out to speak to us, and he said, your son had like a brain bleed that was likely congenital, but he didn't know he had this problem in his brain. And he said, it's like a time bomb that just goes off. And he said, I have no idea what the impact will be with your son. We can't even tell. We have no idea. But the next day, then, in intensive care, the neurosurgeon said, we really need to transport him to university hospitals in Iowa City for more care. And so we did that the next day. He went by helicopter, and we drove. And so then we were at Iowa City, and he had a craniotomy. His brain began to swell. And we had to make the decision if we were going to save his life, not knowing what the outcome was going to be, or if we would, because the swelling would have caused his cerebellum to herniate, and it would have, his automatic heart and lungs, it all would have shut down. So we had to decide, do we save his life not knowing what the outcome will be, or do we let him go if we assume that his life would be of little value. So we made the decision to have the craniotomy. So we saved his life, but we didn't anticipate that we would, that he would face 20 years of unresponsive wakefulness. So
hindsight is always more clear
Yeah.
than foresight. And when we made the decision, Matt was a fighter. He had to work hard for everything he got. And he never gave up. He was so diligent in his schoolwork and he was not the most gifted athlete, but he worked hard at it and he loved it. And he was dedicated to whatever his cause was. And how could we do less?
Yeah, you're betting on your son, right? I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine making a different decision.
I remember thinking, and we only had
15 minutes.
15 minutes to decide. And because the doctor said, look, if we don't do this right now, he is going to die. And in a split moment of time, I thought to myself, what if we let Matt go? And years later, I meet a man like Matt who has the exact same injury, who is thriving today. And the only thing I would think to myself, if only I had saved his life, this could be Matthew today. But we decided to take a shortcut and just let him go. So it was a catch-22, but
And it was the
15 minutes
second
to
time
decide.
because the original surgeon in Des Moines said, I have to have your permission to operate on him. He's a minor. And he will die if I don't do surgery. And he may die on the table. So this is a second choice of whether or not we save his life.
Wow.
so he was at University Hospitals for about 6 weeks, and then he went to a rehabilitation center in Ankeny for 18 months, and then we brought him home, and not knowing if we could even take care of him. But
Yeah.
I'll tell you, we could never have put Matt in an institution because, we really enjoy his presence, and we can be around him.
Well, I think we should interject. When Matt first came home, we had nurses for a little more than 2 years. We had some really good nurses. We had some people who were not as attentive, but we went through 42 nurses in a 2-year period, and it was really overwhelming to have that kind of traffic in and out of our house. And the lady who was our case manager said, I can figure out a way for you and David to do this and be remunerated for his care. And we would go to the basement to get away from the strangers, and we thought how unfair to Matthew that we're not willing to sit with him, but we were glad that we were able to do that. Now, there are restrictions that come with 24-hour-a-day care, but I think in the long run, Matt's better, and we're happy.
Well, we've all commented that Matt wouldn't be here today if it was not Mom and Dad loving him, taking care of him in your home. That's made undoubtedly all the difference.
Yeah, there's too much illness in care facilities and hospitals, and
Even when Matt was at the rehab facility, he had pneumonia often, not because they didn't take good care of him, but because of the traffic of people in and out. And the nurses sometimes come not in the best of health, and then there are a lot of visitors in the facility. That is one reason we don't come to church anymore, because we are Matt's protectors.
Yeah.
We can't expose ourselves, and we can't bring him and expose him to whatever might be in the air.
Well, even in setting this up, I was like, well, I want to make sure that we're well, and do you want us to wear masks? Because I know that it's a very
careful,
real thing. And so you are, as caretakers, full time. I mean, and you work in shifts. Your schedule is quite incredible. I mean, even just finding time for a conversation is tough, let alone probably running errands that you have to do. And you guys have masterfully coordinated, all of it. Always Matt at the center of what's needed,
True.
And so in those early days, I can only try to imagine, just as a parent going through that, and I can imagine your prayers were long and deep and full of passion, but then days turn into weeks and months, and the months turn into years. Tell me, if you wouldn't mind, a little bit about the journey of your faith through all of this, because I know for myself, I would probably be quite rattled, walking through all of that. I mean, it's such a hard thing to imagine. Yet I know today you both are Christ followers, but I know that like the journey has not been easy. And tell me a little bit about that. What sort of turns and maybe peaks and valleys you went through in your faith.
We have different stories.
That's okay.
Mary Jo and I. We have different journeys, and I certainly, for me, this is I'm not a success story. And I'm not a poster boy for faith in action. When this happened, everything changed. It was so sudden and so severe. It was like a gut punch that knocked me out. And as a young Christian, I'd grown up with a theology of a bed of roses, that God was going to prosper me, and physically and financially, and he would be a shield around me, and illness and hardship would not be part of my life. And so when this happened, I just threw everything that was in my toolbox at this injury, and anointings and prayer cloths from around the country. I prayed long and hard for several years for a miracle. And one day I prayed for 9 hours. And I contacted 900 churches in 110 countries to pray for Matt for a miracle. And I heard back from pastors from all over the world. I even heard from the Vatican. One pastor in Kenya wrote back and he said his entire congregation was going to fast the entire week for Matt's miracle. Mm-hmm. And so, Brian, as you know, nothing happened.
Yeah.
And that really plunged me into a darkness that was, that I've never had experienced before. And I was really angry. I felt like God had lied about how protective he could be. Mm. And it wasn't safe to commit my kids to him because he didn't protect them. Mm. And he didn't answer these prayers. Thousands of people have prayed for Matthew Hudson, and nothing has happened. And so I was very angry and bitter, and but at the same time, Mary Jo and I, we understood that we had to just put our hands to the plow and just go. And if I don't get up at 5:30 every morning, Matthew doesn't get his medicine or breakfast. So we just had to, it's like, well, we don't have a choice. If we don't get up and help Matt live, he will not live. And I guess over time, I can't tell you the conversations I had with God because you'd have to censor them. But over time, I learned, I think God has taught me that life is hard. Mm-hmm. Some people have hard days, hard years, and hard lives. And Jesus said that, there's going to be tribulation. And I think the kingdom of God is so complex that the Lord can't explain to me why Matt can't be healed. It's too complicated. I would never understand it. Mm. But at the same time, Matthew is a Christian. I saw him kneel at a church service and ask Christ to come into his life when he was a little boy. So at the same time, I recognize that there will be joy someday. And that I think the Lord is telling me, David, there was a Christian who's gone through 10 times more than you've experienced. And his name was Paul. And he looked at his tribulation in life and he thought it was light and momentary affliction. I'm trying to learn how to put these years in perspective. And every day is hard for me. Some days are harder. But at the same time, you know, the Lord has sustained us. I mean, when I look back 20, I think, gee, it's been 20 years. Doesn't seem like it's been 20 years. And maybe we don't have that much farther to go. Maybe another 20 and we're all done. I don't know. But he has sustained us. What are your thoughts, Mary Jo, about your journey?
I think my walk with the Lord has always proven one thing, and that is that he's faithful. The night of Matt's injury, when we were at the hospital, we had 40 people, friends, family, Matt's pals, who showed up the night and prayed through the evening for us. I remember having a little interaction with Matt when I was the parent saying, where are you going to be? Who are you going to be with? What are you going to do? And he turned to me and he said, Mom, you don't have to worry about me. I have nice friends. And we found out how true that, I mean, we loved all the boys that he hung out with. They really were nice friends, and their parents put together an amazing benefit for Matt before he came home. You know, there was a silent auction. I think 700 people showed up. They planned on about 350, and I think the caterer must have prayed pretty hard over that food to make it stretch. But really nice friends. We've had people pray for Matt. God has been so faithful in so many ways and provided every step of the way. Here's a miracle for you. Because of David's work, we didn't have health insurance when Matt was going to play football, and we always took out a temporary insurance policy because I knew how aggressive he could be. And so that summer we took out a short-term health insurance policy for Matt. It happened that year his football team went to a football camp. So instead of starting at August 1st, which was the beginning of two-a-days, we made it start in June, middle of June. It was a 6-month policy, and Matt's injury was July 28th. You can only imagine after 4 brain surgeries what the medical expenses would have been.
It was $1 million policy, major medical.
Wow.
And our premium for 6 months was like $180. And when we left Iowa City, when his policy finally lapsed, the insurance had spent $750,000 on that.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. But that's
The miracle.
what an amazing thing that was there. Yeah.
Well, not only that, Brian, but when he had part of his skull removed, they said, we'll put this back eventually, but we can't tell you now when it's going to be.
Yeah.
So David looked at the policy, and it had this rider in it that said, if the treatment is not complete at the end of 6 months when this policy runs out, we'll extend it. And they extended that policy for another 12 months. So he was covered for 18 months, which really saved us from medical bankruptcy.
Wow.
We just couldn't have financially navigated that road at all without that insurance policy. And even when Matt came home, the insurance paid for his wheelchair and the bed that he was going to have. And they looked at all of this equipment preventatively. We want to prevent bed sores. So they bought him a bed that rotates him at the night so we don't have to get up multiple times and rotate him or changed his position, and his wheelchair has a special seat in it to prevent skin breakdown, and on and on and on. Someone gave us a handicap van. Gave us. It was a gift that was run through the Roosevelt Foundation. One of Matt's chums was an attorney serving on the foundation. He handled all the legal. I mean, we could just go through the list. People from church who donated for our new ramp.
And that's really, I wanted to mention that, you know, there are a lot of people at Lifehouse that do not know us. And I remember when I came one Wednesday night to hear you teach on the Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
And there were probably 50 people there. And I didn't recognize anybody. But here, the church, who they've never met Matt, they don't really know us. But, you know, the call went forth that our 18-year-old ramp needed some repair. And, you know, what a blessing that, you know, just out of the blue, you came over to say, hey, we're going to do something for you that we didn't expect. And
Just kind of curious, are there other lessons? I mean, the way you've had to love your son, you know, which, I mean, my kids, you know, as your other kids have, you know, grown up, go out, and then, you know, we're not actively having to look after them every day, but as you said, that devotion of, you know, you're up at 5:30 and, you know, the rhythms you've had to create, but and you've mentioned some of the lessons you've begun to piece together. What are there other lessons about life, loving your family, your kids, maybe even your grandkids that you've learned through Matt, loving Matt and walking through what you walked through?
Well, one of our dearest friends lost their only child to brain cancer. And every day, and I think if I would like to be doing something like visiting one of my other children who live out of state, they don't have the option of loving their only child. And so I get to love Matthew every day. He's an entity I can touch and feel and kiss and hug, and he does respond to us in some capacity. So I am so grateful that we have him at home. I often say, yeah, you're my best friend, you're my best boy, because you listen to all my stories and you never complain.
you know, before Matt's injury, I never paid much attention to disabled people. Just never took a second look. But today, you know, Matthew can't do anything. But he still is really valuable.
Yes.
And I think, you know, that when we look at disabled people who have diminished abilities, that sometimes we discount them or they become second-class citizens. And Matthew is precious. His worth is not grounded in anything he can do or make or become. But his life is still really precious. And I just never looked at like that before, you know.
Yeah.
I don't really cry this much.
I invited you to probably the hardest conversation of your month at least, but
you know, it's still raw,
yeah.
and I mean, he is a precious son, and I miss him terribly. But I miss more the life he has not been able to live. I mean, he would have been a great husband, a great dad, he would have been a wonderful young man, but he has not been able to pursue his hopes and dreams, and that's really sad.
Yeah.
Um,
As a parent, I don't know how you can't think about that continually, right? It's, we all, I can't think of anyone that wouldn't want a preferred different future,
Right.
for Matt.
We had a friend who visited us a few years ago. After his time with us, he wrote David a letter that I think is really our mission now. And he said, God has called you to preserve the life and dignity of one person. And that's our mission now, Brian. We have one life to preserve, to protect, to do everything we can. And we strive every day to do that with all the love and compassion of Christ.
And that's it's a sacred duty. It's a highest calling.
Yes.
And to lay, and in one sense, lay your life down for your son.
He can't say thank you. There is not anything Matthew can do to repay us for what we do for him. And isn't that the greatest privilege, to be able to lay your life down for somebody else without any thought of reward?
And you would never do it for the reward, you just because,
Right.
For love. And the wonderful hope we have is that one day he will probably thank you beyond your wildest dreams.
Yeah.
But then I think about the riches you have amassed in heaven, and you will receive a praise and reward from Christ, I believe, that is unmatched. And
Could we get that in writing?
That's right.
Yeah, I don't know how anyone goes
yeah.
through this without
Yeah.
believing in Jesus. I mean, we know
Yeah.
families that do, but I don't know how they do it. How do they face each day
yeah.
without the strength of the Lord?
It's for
The
hope.
confidence.
It's for hope, right? If we did
Right.
not have hope, suffering would be pointless.
Yeah.
I mean, but for hope, that's what we cling to. And just like Paul said, we'd be pitied among all. If we didn't have the hope of the resurrection,
Right.
we'd be a laughing stock.
Yeah.
But we have that hope. And it isn't for this life in the way that sometimes we want to bank on and hope that it is. We want to I want it today. I want it now. It's stored up for later in its fullness, at least. One of the things that's come along, out of the many sacrifices you make, one of those along the way, as you pointed out earlier, is you have to be alone a lot. You have to be solitary. I know that you see your grandkids probably more via video
Right.
and photos, and that has been a heavy. That's been a big cost for you personally.
Right.
I kind of wondering about, though, yet at the same time, when it comes to our body, even though you've not had a chance to meet all these people that come in and out over the years, but you have always been a constant, a staple. I, myself, and anyone that's been there for a long time knows you're at the core of our church. And it strikes me how amazing that is, because there's other people who don't show up every week. Yet they really haven't drawn to the core and really become the heart and the function of the church, but somehow you do remain that. And even though you may be out of sight, your presence is always known. And I think it's important you hear that and know that it is. And
That's kind
I'm
of
just
you.
kind of curious, how do you think that's possible? Like, in what way how do you view yourself as attached to the body of Christ?
Well, I often pray for the needs of the church, and we pray often for you and your family.
And
And
we appreciate that.
because of that relationship, many people don't know that I worked in the office for 10 years, so we have a
She
stronger
knows too much.
relationship. I know we have a man of integrity leading our flock. I keep in touch with some of the old timers who've been around for a long time, particularly those who had children. Those people who knew Matt as a young person before his injury have been constant in our lives and continuing to pray for him, and we stay attached to them, and we continue to give to the church because we believe in the mission. And
Yeah. So in all of this, what has the Lord taught you about perseverance? Or maybe how's the definition of perseverance changed for you, from over 20 years? And how might you give advice or help to someone else who's walking through just a terrible time?
go ahead.
Well, I thought of a verse about the whole notion of perseverance, and the Lord, I kind of stumbled on this verse a long time ago, and it's kind of become my life verse because of Matt's situation. And it's in Habakkuk, the last few verses in this chapter. He says, even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet will I rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. So it's like, if it's all stripped away, we still have to get up in the morning. But if we lose everything except our very lives, our strength is going to be gone somehow. And we don't have any other place to turn. It's the Lord or nothing else,
Yeah.
I don't know how He has sustained us, but He has.
Yep. One day at a time, one step at a time. We do what we have to do each day. I think that's the nature of perseverance. You just do the next right thing.